关公巡城。龙凤呈祥。鲤鱼翻身。
For thousands of years, China fiercely guarded the secret of tea's cultivation and manufacture. The British Empire sought to change that in 1848 by mounting one of the most audacious espionage missions ever undertaken, to enter forbidden China and steal the secret of tea. The man they entrusted with this mission was a 36-year-old Scottish botanist. The first Europeans to encounter tea were Portuguese explorers in 1606. Over the next 2 centuries, the West became addicted to its unique flavour, to its hints of luxury and exoticism. In Britain, the desirability of tea was heavily promoted by the East India Company, a commercial empire founded on its trade.
This trade grew to be so significant that although the East India Company was effective ruler in most of India, the net revenues from the China tea trade to the East India Company in 1800 exceeded those of its Indian empire effectively. The East India Company ruled over something like a quarter of world's trade and 20% of the population of the planet. That's like Microsoft, Coca-Cola, McDonald's and about 20 others rolled into one.
Les Chinois sont quand même d'excellents commerçants et ils profitaient bien évidemment de ce monopole de fait qu'ils avaient en proposant à des prix qui étaient assez élevés et aussi en proposant des quantités assez faibles pour donner un petit peu de rareté à leurs produits. Et donc les Anglais ont eu besoin très rapidement d'avoir une monnaie d'échange aussi, parce que les Anglais ne faisaient qu'acheter des produits aux Chinois, mais les Chinois ne leur achetaient strictement rien.
Really, the only way of paying for tea that the Chinese would accept was silver bullion. The company, could not afford to pay in silver bullion unless it found some means of getting the silver bullion back from the Chinese. Lo and behold, up came the magic solution, which of course was the opium trade.
Aujourd'hui, quand on pense à l'opium, on pense à la Chine, mais ce sont les Anglais qui ont introduit l'opium en Chine.
They started growing opium in India, particularly around Patna, from the late 1750s onwards. This trade developed until some 20, 30 years later, represented something like 5% of the revenues of the East India Company. They didn't actually export opium directly to China, but what they did was sell it for silver bullion at Calcutta auctions to private traders. They turned a blind eye on the fact that the private traders would then smuggle it into China and sell it for silver bullion.
When the British demand for tea escalated dramatically in the early 1800s, the East India Company responded by increasing tenfold the production of opium. The world's most dominant colonial power became its largest opium merchant, and China a nation of addicts.
Because of the ban that the emperor put upon opium in 1838, quite understandably when something like a quarter of his subjects were supposedly addicted to the substance, that closed down the opium trade and in its train cut down or at least debilitated the tea trade, which meant that this vital commodity was no longer as easily accessible to the East India Company and the other companies operating out of Canton than it had been.
In 1839, Britain retaliated by initiating the Opium Wars in order to gain access to tea. The derelict Chinese army proved no match for the might of the British imperial forces. the emperor was obliged to concede access to 5 harbours and title to the island of Hong Kong. The East India Company, though, was still hostage to China's monopoly on tea, which was in short supply. So the company decided to reinvigorate its attempts at growing tea in India. But it did not have China's expert knowledge of cultivation and manufacture, and decided to obtain that knowledge by any means.
Robert Fortune was really the only person who had the experience of China who could be recruited for an expedition to move the tea industry. He was the only person in the 1840s with the knowledge and the practical experience of what it was like in China.
Robert Fortune had combed the coast of China 3 years earlier in search of rare plants. A fearless traveller, curious and passionate, he had brought back 100 plants unknown in Europe, including many rhododendrons, peonies, and azaleas. He also introduced the art of bonsai to the West.
He gained the position of curator of the Chelsea Physic Garden here, and he would have lived, in fact, where I'm standing now, because I'm his successor but 7. And that was a fairly sort of plum appointment, sort of top position, and he gained that from his exploits, really, in China.
The mastermind of Fortune's secret mission was the governor of India, the Marquis of Dalhousie, who commanded from Calcutta on July the 3rd, 1848.
You are requested to select plants and seeds of the best description of the species Thea viridis, green tea, from the most desirable localities, and to convey these under your own charge from China to Calcutta, and from thence to the Himalayas.
Robert Fortune was an able man, but also he was interested in his own advancement and that of his family, and he was paid £100 a year at the Physic Garden, and the East India Company offered him £500 a year to go to China. So that was a fair incentive for him.
Fortune sailed into Shanghai, which was then little more than a fishing village and fledgling trading post. He made it his base and wrote in his travellogue,
"On one fine afternoon in the month of September 1848, I found myself once more in a boat on the Shanghai River. Nothing can give the Chinese a higher idea of our civilization and attainments than our love of flowers, or tend more to create a kindly feeling between us and them. Chinese plants have not only been introduced to Europe to enliven and beautify our park and gardens, but we have also enriched those of the Celestial Empire with the production of the West. The American Magnolia grandiflora has been introduced here and promises to be a very ornamental tree."
Prior to his arrival in Shanghai, Fortune had learnt that his mission would not only include the collecting of plants, but recruiting skilled Chinese tea workers for India. Fortune felt uncomfortable about this addition to his duties, but he was left with no choice as he prepared to venture into the Forbidden Zone.
Fortune also, of course, had to learn Chinese when he was over there, and he went out with a dictionary of Chinese. He also, because he was not allowed to travel more than 30 miles from the main ports of China, in order to get more exposure to plants, he had to dress as a Chinaman, and there was a certain amount of subterfuge in his moving away inland into China.
I was under no illusion. My disguise would only be truly effective in regions where white men had never been seen. Death. That was the penalty I would face if I were to be discovered any further than 30 miles from here. But I could not travel alone. How would I rent a boat or order a meal?
Death was also the penalty faced by anyone who agreed to help Fortune or betrayed the secrets of tea.
Finally, I succeeded in convincing 2 Chinese men to travel with me. Wang, who would serve me as my valet and linguist, and also a coolie. Both men came from the Huangshan region, which is renowned for its fine green tea. That was precisely where I wanted to go. No one had ever brought back tea plants from that region. We left Shanghai by night to avoid curiosity. Having procured a pair of scissors, my servant clipped the hair from the front, back and sides of my head, leaving only a patch upon the crown. He took up a small razor and began to shave my head, until the tears came running down my cheeks and I cried out with pain. I then dressed myself in the costume of the country, and the result was pronounced by my servants and the boatmen to be very satisfactory. And they gave me the Chinese name of Xinghua. I was ready to face the unknown. A few days later, we disembarked at the gates of the forbidden city of Hangzhou.
Hangzhou was the major trading centre for green tea, and remains so to this day.
I sent my servants to rent a sedan chair. The porters began to take me through the city. There were a vast number of tea shops and tea houses. They were all crowded with hundreds of natives. They had spent the money on an excellent locally produced tea that I had never seen in London. It is called Dragonwell, and I was told it grows nearby. I knew it was not prudent of me, but I had to see for myself how that tea was produced.
The greatest difficulty Fortune faced was manipulating information from the Chinese. He could not question them directly, as that would have aroused suspicion. He had to silently observe and listen, especially to their legends.
咱们这里龙井狮峰这里呢，有个年纪比较大的妇女，她呢是种茶制茶叶的。有一天呢，外地呢来了一个人，是寻宝的人，看到他家里呢有个石球，他就给这个老妇人说呢，要买他这个石球。老妇人想，这么这个破烂的东西，这个人都要买，他就很爽快地答应他了。那么晚上的话，老妇人呢要把这个石球呢很好的洗了一下，把它清洗干净。他为的是卖出去的东西呢能够比较漂亮一点，但是呢，他把这个洗下来的水呢，他就倒到这个茶树里去了。第二天，寻宝的人来的话，要买这个石球，一看呢，这个石球是新的了，就都很干净了，他就不要了。他说这个宝贝都刨掉了。那么我们知道这个宝贝呢，他就刨到这个茶树地里去了。这个老妇人这里的18棵茶树呢，就长得非常的好，做出来的茶叶呢品质也非常好。
Here on Lion's Peak, the 18 tea trees of the legend are enclosed by fences. These trees are used exclusively for producing tea for the emperor. Could it be that the tea owed its quality to the soil? At an inn, my servants placed the order for our meal. I had not eaten with chopsticks for 3 years, and I had no confidence in my talents in the use of them. As it was, I was quite certain that I should draw the eyes of the Chinamen upon me. I had no lunch that day, and I had to renounce my dinner as well.
Fortune's servants secured passage upriver to the area of Huangshan, source of the best green tea consumed in Europe.
Now the progress of the boat slowed. The crew fought against the rapids every inch of the way. 15 men with long ropes fastened to the mast of our boat were tracking along the shore, and 5 or 6 more were poling with long bamboos.
Fortune was ever watchful, maintaining a low profile.
One of the passengers on the boat was a confirmed opium smoker. I have seen many opium smokers in my travels, but this one was the most pitiable of them all. He no longer distinguished night from day. He would wake screaming from nightmares and fling himself upon the first person he encountered. I was on my guard all the time, afraid to be unmasked. Every morning I would leave the boat and walk along the riverbank until sunset in order to avoid facing the opium smoker.
The river was a major trading route for tea coming down from Huangshan and for opium being smuggled upstream.
The river here is considered the highway or passage from one district to the other and is well guarded by soldiers. Each province has its own guard town. These two parties formed a sort of border guard and bore each other, I believe, little good. We changed boats as the river had become shallower. We were now walking to reach Tunche, the capital of the Huangshan. At an inn, one fellow who probably was sharp enough to detect something unusual in my appearance was determined not to be put off in this way and kept asking me a variety of questions. The old innkeeper came up and said with the utmost gravity, "It is of no use your talking to this person. He understands the Quanhua or court dialect only. You do not speak that, and of course he cannot understand you, nor you him." This seemed to be perfectly satisfactory to all parties, and I was left unmolested.
Fortune's servants rented sedan chairs. They took the road for Sung Lo Shan, the hill where green tea is said to have been discovered.
We were to stay with the Wangs, my servant's family. They lived close to the foot of the Sung Lo mountain. The local population quickly guessed I was a foreigner. Nevertheless, they welcomed me in their farms and let me observe as much as I liked. As if a conspiracy of silence were protecting me in the heart of this inaccessible mountain.
石龙山这名气，就是历史上那《本草纲目》就有记载，它是特别是看到批发的时候都有送入3000，但是它送入3000主要的就是有冠心病啊、高血压，治疗这一类的这个病情。它这个外敷作用呢，它可以外敷，就是讲是那个冻疮呢，它摆在嘴里咬过以后呢，就敷上去的冻疮自然而然的它就会掉下来。
In London, tea was at the heart of the medical debate. Was it good or bad for health? Clearly, this tea has medicinal properties. I knew that I must bring back the seeds of these trees so that they could be examined in India. What is it that gives one tea medicinal qualities which are not to be found in another?
松萝茶的话，它特别的话呢，主要的话呢，它这个一个是它的这个品种，它是个松萝品种、茶树品种；再一个，它一个特定的这个区域环境，它这个土壤里面含有银元素，所以这个它这个是松萝茶的话呢，不是其他地方所能种植的，也不是其他地方的话呢所能生产的， 就是在我们这个特定的这个小区域、小环境当中而形成的。首先闻香气，我们黄山毛峰这个香气很高。再看汤色，茶叶的汤色，清澈明亮，尝滋味。黄山毛峰的茶叶是鲜纯。回甜，黄山毛峰的香气特点，香气不但高，而且长。热闻的时候有香气，现在冷了，茶叶还是有香气。我们闻茶叶的时候要用鼻子深呼吸，摇一下子，香气就出来了。这还有一个动作哈，看叶底。黄山毛峰的芽头肥壮。
I could hardly wait to communicate my findings. Medicinal teas are produced from tea trees of the same variety as other non-medicinal teas, and the quality of the tea depends upon the quality of the soil and climate where it is grown. If the seeds I had collected were grown successfully in our nurseries in the Himalayas, they would produce excellent teas. The risks I had taken travelling here incognito would have been fully rewarded.
Fortune returned to Shanghai, elated at the success of his 3-month expedition. He immediately reported to the government of India.
15th December. I have much pleasure in informing you that I have procured a large supply of seeds and young plants, which I trust will get safely to India. I believe the whole of them to be the same species, Thea viridis, green tea. A portion of the seeds collected during the last 2 months shall be sown in the gardens here and reared to be sent to India afterwards.
Since there were no botanical gardens, the experimental laboratories of the time, Fortune used the private gardens of complicit British merchants and consulates. 2 months later, he faced his greatest challenge, dispatching his precious living cargo to India by boat. The tea seeds were packed in coarse bags and boxes filled with soil, but the young green tea plants, Fortune decided to transport in the revolutionary Ward's cases. Before the case's invention, only 1 plant in 1,000 survived a long sea voyage.
Ward's cases, or airtight cases, are not strictly speaking airtight, but they are so close that the moisture cannot escape. And therefore, if the soil be well watered before the case is closed, the moisture is retained in sufficient quantity to support plants during a voyage to or from the most distant parts of the world. Unless there is someone on board who understands the cultivation of plants, the cases should never be opened from the time they are shipped until they arrive at their destination.
Fortune sailed to Hong Kong with the Ward's cases and seeds. They were then consigned in small shipments on several boats to minimise the risk. The boats looked like floating gardens departing for Calcutta. While delighted at their dispatch, Fortune knew he had failed in recruiting skilled Chinese tea workers for India. But rather than address that issue, he slipped off on a self-appointed mission to collect plants from the finest black tea districts of mainland China. On the outskirts of Fuchao stands Kuchan, the Drum Mountain. Fortune's destination was the Buddhist temple at the summit. Pilgrims still come here in their thousands, climbing the mountain as Fortune did, on foot.
When we consider that these poor deluded people sometimes travel a distance of several hundred miles to worship in the temples, we cannot but admire their spirit of devotion. Although no Christian can look upon the priests and devotees of the Buddhist creed without an eye of pity, yet he must give them credit for their conduct, since he has every reason to believe them sincere. And I am inclined to believe that justice has not been done them in this respect. There is a spring behind the temple, renowned for its purity. The monks took a cup and filled it with water at the spring. They all praised its virtues, and it certainly was excellent water. I told them it was the best I had ever tasted, and they then brought me a cup of tea made with water from the same spring. We are forever complaining about the poor quality of the tea recently sold in England. Perhaps we should consider the quality of the water we use to brew the tea.
Fortune then travelled north up the coast to the Tentung Temple near Ningpo, which he had visited on his first trip to China 3 years earlier. He felt safe there. Fortune knew that the Buddhist temples in China were the best places to obtain first-hand information about tea, as it is closely tied to Buddhism, an essential part of a ritual which has not changed in thousands of years.
中国有2年来世了作业，那么对我们中国的传统来讲嘛，眼睛也有好处，胃也有好处啊，还是自己种自己加工，到高压就大概唐朝才开始用到高压去了，特别是嘛在宋朝时候呢，那么日本呢，后上呢到这里天龙寺来采下来呢，就把天龙寺给作业呢带回去普及到日本。那么对日本来讲呢，普及都是各种做到位，对日本来，只有日本老百姓都知道啊，对做蛮重视。
One day, Fortune overheard 2 monks reading aloud from a precious book. The elder monk was explaining to the younger that the classic of tea, written in the 8th century, was the world's first comprehensive study of tea. It is still the reference book today.
Man must test himself in 9 ways for the right of tea. He must prepare the tea. He must develop his sense of discernment and choose the best one. He must procure the right instruments. He must build the fire according to the rules. He must choose the best water. He must roast the tea just right. He must crush it thoroughly. He must boil it to the height of perfection. Finally, he must drink it. Quote from Lu Yu's The Classic of Tea.
鲁豫是我们的茶的祖宗了，茶圣，也一个茶僧。那他呢，创造这个对人类来讲呢，做出很大的贡献。这个茶经一共是7000多字，7000多字这个茶经，现在是各个国家呢都有了。茶之为用，味自寒，为饮最易精行见得之人。因为我们过去呢，这个茶呢没有书呢，大家不知道。鲁豫他讲的茶怎么样种，怎么样制造，怎么样保管，怎么样运输，怎么样吃，整个的茶经呢，一共写了这个三卷10章，10个问题上你看到的10个问题10章，所以这样的话呢，详细的记载，等于这是我们中国历史上农业一部巨大的著作。就是茶叶的巨著。
In Ningpo, Fortune prepared himself to once more infiltrate forbidden territory. His destination was the region of Wuishan, long regarded as producing the best black tea in China. Fortune took with him a new servant, Xinghu. It was on his advice that Fortune posed as a Mandarin dignitary.
We left Ningpo in May 1849, Xinghu carrying a banner that could be unfurled to announce the presence of a high-ranking Mandarin. Simply by waving the flag, we were able to overtake a queue of 50 boats waiting to be winched over to the next canal.
Fortune continued up the river to the Wuishan.
Here, the river had become too shallow to navigate. I was forced to continue by sedan chair along mountain roads.
While travelling along the Great Imperial Road, Fortune unexpectedly encountered many Chinese black tea merchants, whose presence greatly added to the risk of his being exposed. But it was too late to turn back, and there was no alternative route.
The long trains of coolies laden with chests of travellers presented a busy and curious scene as they toiled up the mountainside or were seen winding their way through the valleys. Fine teas never touched the ground to prevent the dust from entering the crates. The single chests were carried by lashing 2 bamboo sticks to the chest, one on each side, so as to form a triangle. By this means, a man could carry the chest upon his shoulders. Finally, we arrived at the top of the mountain pass. I was overwhelmed by the landscape, the tea gardens of the Wuishan. The veritable cradle of tea opened up before me.
Fortune had finally reached his destination, but the long and stressful journey had begun to take its toll.
Was it a reality? Or a dream? Or was it some fairyland? The longer I looked, the more indistinct the objects became. And fancy seemed inclined to convert the rocks and trees into strange living forms. On all sides, the strangest rocks and hills were observed, having a temple and a tea manufactory near their summits.
当时的时候有个秀才啊，要到京都啊去考状元，那路过武夷山，当时因为呢这个在路途上的奔波疲倦中暑，最后呢昏厥在路上，那这个寺庙的僧人呐，到山下最后呢发现了这一个秀才，就把他呢背到山上那用什么药最好呢？就是用我们听先勇的禅师制作出来的茶把他呢治好了。那考上了头名状元他呢就是要来报恩要来报这里的佛恩最后呢他就到了武夷山那这个出家人呢就把他带到这棵茶树的上面叫他看就是当年救你这个病的就是这个茶那问他这个茶叫什么，他说目前还没有取名。那这个状元非常的感激跪下去礼拜这个茶，因为这个茶是他的救命之恩。那所以说呢，他呢就把身上的红袍脱下来，披在茶的上面。
And that tea was the great red robe tea. Xinghu had informed the village people that I was a Mandarin from Tartary, which lay beyond the Great Wall. The village people were naturally very curious to see a traveller who had come from so far away, and it was vital that I remain in character. I visited many of the tea farms. The soil of these tea lands consists of a brownish-yellow adhesive clay. This clay, when minutely examined, is found to consist of particles of the rocks and of vegetable matter. These lands are very productive, and where the tea shrub thrives best. It is quite a surprise to see that the tea trees which grow here are of the same variety as those I had observed in the green tea region. So what is it, I wonder, that makes a tea turn brown or black? It must surely be in the way that the teas are prepared.
The tea manufacturers were in the midst of harvest, and Fortune observed the natural fermentation of leaves for 6 or more hours. They turned red on the edge, but remained green at the centre.
This phase is essential. I understood now that the red or brownish colour did not result from heating, as was commonly held, but from the fermentation process, somewhat akin to autumn leaves which fall to the ground and turn red in the following hours and days. The black tea, which we are used to drinking in Europe, is simply fully fermented tea. Then pan firing. This is the first time heating is used to stop fermentation. Then rolling the leaves. And finally, drying of the leaves takes place. The tea sorting workers, who are always female, remove dust and stems. The first or basic manufacture is now complete. I was now able to offer proof of what I had suspected from my first trip in China, which is that, contrary to what was generally held to be true, black and green tea plants were from the same species. The difference in colour and flavour is solely the result of different modes of preparation. I was overjoyed at this discovery.
Recently, measures were taken to preserve this fragile region from the effects of pollution and deforestation. The descendants of the villagers Fortune once knew have been forced to give up their homes and move to a new village outside the protected zone.
哇，这个是历史以来就是做茶的，反正这个整个我这个天心村，从历史到现在没有什么不做茶的，祖祖辈辈都是以茶为生，是这样子一回事。完了这边好像是99年正式过来到这边过来住。99年过来住。他是为了世界遗产、双遗产，因为景区里面不能有人家住房，是这样一回事。所以把全部整个村庄全部一起搬了1300多人口吧，好像吧，全部一起迁出来的，好像在里面搞不能在里面居住好像污染的东西啊，是这样的问题吧，好像是这样的事情。可以了吧？
现在就看这点，这个呢，这个茶叶，这个小棵我们绑了，现在还有小棵的茶叶呢，这样种着呢。老头子，你比一下呢，还有茶叶。茶叶。这个茶，后面以前是菜园。
这个是用把这个枝叶啊剪下来插的，插在里面的。这个茶树要到山上的老丛划过来要这么高，把那压枝。放在扦插了以后，要1年，再把它移过来再种。
Fortune charmed many farmers and succeeded in collecting more than 400 tea plants, an enormous treasure trove.
Together with our now very substantial luggage, we embarked upon the long journey back to Shanghai.
In the garden of a British merchant, Fortune prepared his shipment of black tea plants for India and eagerly awaited news of his earlier cargo of green tea plants to the Himalayas. 3 months later, Dr. Jamieson, superintendent of the experimental tea gardens in India, wrote,
"A much apparent delay has occurred, but this was necessary in order to allow time for the seeds to have a fair trial and the plants to rally from the effects of the journey. The result has been an entire failure, and not one seed having germinated. I lately removed a number of the seeds from the beds. I found them to be rotten."
In Shanghai, a bitterly disappointed Fortune learnt that Dr. Jamieson had destroyed the green tea plants by mistakenly ordering that the wards cases be opened on their journey between Calcutta and the Himalayas. Fortune grew anxious that the black tea plants en route to India would meet with the same fate. But Dr. Falconer, superintendent of the Calcutta Botanical Gardens, saved the day by instructing Jamieson not to interfere with this new shipment. A relieved Fortune then busied himself with solving how to transport the next batch of seeds, as those previously sent in bags and boxes had not survived.
I had to find a solution. I decided to encourage germination of the seeds during the journey in their wards cases.
Fortune's innovative approach proved a triumph, the seeds germinating as planned on the boats to India. Excited by this news, Fortune was about to set off to procure yet more seeds when a letter from the Marquis of Dalhousie reminded him of duties still to be completed.
The government considers that it is absolutely necessary to procure skillful manufacturers for the plantations in India. You must, of course, however, exercise your own discretion in determining the time when you may be able with prudence to take steps to engage them.
Given the difficulties of convincing Chinese tea workers and manufacturers to risk their lives by going to India, it took Fortune more than a year to recruit them.
16th March 1851. I have the very great satisfaction to report that I have engaged the services of 6 Chinese tea makers and 2 lead men for the space of 3 years, and have brought them round. I have taken every means to secure proper treatment for them. They are simple but respectable countrymen, and much of the success which may follow their introduction will depend upon their being protected from bad treatment. In due time, all arrived at their destination in perfect safety and were handed over to Dr. Jameson. When the cases were opened, the tea plants were found to be in a very healthy state. No fewer than 13,000 plants were counted in the cases, and many more were germinating. Soon after my arrival, I received orders to visit all the tea plantations and to draw up a report upon their conditions and future prospects in the Himalayas. On the vegetation of China and the Himalayas, the resemblance is certainly very striking, except in the low valleys of the Himalayas. The plants generally do not appear to me to be in that fresh and vigorous condition which I have been accustomed to seeing in good Chinese plantations. Considering that until lately we had little or no information as to how the tea plant was managed in China, the only wonder is that so few mistakes have been made in its cultivation. I shall now offer some suggestions for its improvement. First, cultivation on the hillsides. Such land exists in the Himalayas to an almost unlimited extent. Then, good tea land is naturally moist. When tea will not grow without irrigation, it is a sure sign that the land employed is not suitable for such a crop. One must also adapt the gathering of leaves to the climate. Finally, the Chinese manufacturers I brought round confirmed that the young plants are never touched until the 3rd or 4th year after they have been planted. If part of this land produced tea, India would then have a healthy beverage to drink, besides a commodity which would be of great value in the market. A boon will have been conferred upon the people of India of not common kind, and one of which an enlightened and liberal government may well be proud in conferring upon its subjects.
I think from his writings you get the sense that he was interested in economic growth, in new crops, in potentials that would benefit people. And I think essentially at heart he was a philanthropist. I think he was trying to benefit people. But of course it was set within a context of empire and imperial crops.
At the end of his 3-year mission, Fortune returned to London. The East India Company authorised him to write a book of his travels in China. Fortune produced a romanticised account, deleting carefully all the details that could compromise his secret activities. By subtly demystifying the aura surrounding Chinese tea, Fortune also prepared British readers to the idea of drinking tea from other places, such as India. The book was a bestseller and brought fame and social standing to this otherwise humble botanist. Fortune's innovations in shipping tea seeds and the expertise of the Chinese manufacturers he brought with him made possible the intensive cultivation of Chinese tea plants in India and later in other British colonies. Cropping and manufacturing techniques were gradually improved and adapted to industrial-scale production. India soon became a model for tea production worldwide. Within 50 years of Fortune's mission, with India and Ceylon now satisfying British and European demand, Britain abruptly stopped buying tea from China and halted the opium trade. The Chinese tea industry collapsed. Imperial Chinese rule, then in severe decline, had no means by which to react, and the nation's economy was devastated. It was only in the 1950s that the Chinese were able to rebuild their once great tea industry. To this day, Fortune's espionage activities remain unknown in China. Equally clouded in mystery is that the best of Indian tea is still produced from Chinese tea plants stolen by Fortune.
Darjeeling is known as the champagne of teas. The difference between Darjeeling and other teas is that Darjeeling is known for its very high aromatic quality. These bushes are over 100 years old. The seeds are originally said to have been brought from China and propagated in Darjeeling.
Each country is seen as having sovereignty over its own natural material. So rather than the common benefit of mankind for everybody to develop and use in trade, plants are being seen as the possession of the country in which they originate. If there is plant exchange and commercial benefit is gained from that, then the country from which the plant material came is entitled to share in those benefits. And it's a sea change in the way people behave, and it's not the way Fortune behaved, but it's a new climate of international cooperation.
Fortune went on to yet more tea plant collecting missions. From 5 successive journeys in China, the Philippines and Japan, he also brought back to Europe 200 new plant species, which was sold at auction and dispersed to botanical gardens around the world. One can find in nearly every garden a plant which carries his name, Fortunae. The reputation of this extraordinary botanist has never been tarnished by his espionage activities, by his role in the world's most profitable robbery of tea from China.